All right, everyone, we're going to kick off the first E-Train Academy Zoom seminar here. We're a few minutes past the 1:30 start time, so we appreciate everybody, 1:30 Eastern start time. We appreciate everybody jumping on here. We're going to admit people as they trickle in, but we appreciate everybody coming as close as possible to the start time. And if you do know anybody who was planning to come that just had something come up and wasn't able to make it, you can let them know that there will be a recording of this available afterwards, and you'll be the first ones to receive that link ahead of others. So with that, I want to open it up to starting the first E-Train Academy Zoom seminar, and just reorient everybody to on Zoom how we will do some Q&A a little bit later in the discussion. But if you do have any questions that come up along the way, feel free to open the chat window at the bottom of the screen, and that will pop up a dialogue on the right side of your screen where you can send a message either to the entire group, everyone is what it'll say, or directly to me, the host. So if you want to send that message privately, and then I can direct it to the right person. So I'm going to introduce who's here on this side from E-Train right now. First we have Sergeant Hall, Rudolph Hall. He's currently at NYPD. He's been there for over 20 years. Extensive experience in gang work in Brooklyn. Joint Terrorism Task Force. Worked on the Boston Marathon bombing, among other things. And we first met during our interactions with NYPD's Risk Management Bureau. Sergeant Hall is a vet of the NYPD. He's seen a lot of things, and he brings a very unique perspective to what we've been trying to accomplish with E-Train for the last several years now. We look forward to doing a dialogue really mostly with him on his experience, what he's seeing, and how the nature of police training is really changing. And he's really been at the forefront of body-worn cameras. And he's called upon by many departments around the country for his expertise in this area. So we're glad to have him here. Thanks for being here, Rudy.
Thank you.
Okay. And then Jordan Muraskin, he's my partner in crime on this whole thing. And he's the CTO for E-Train, for the company deCervo that makes E-Train. And I'm Jason. Jordan and I started doing this stuff a long time ago at Columbia University when he was a Ph.D. student. I was a postdoc, and it had nothing to do with police at the time. It had to do with baseball, and then before that, it had to do with music. And so, just to explain to you what that means really quickly, we were looking at how the brain makes quick decisions. That's really what we were doing at Columbia. It had nothing to do with application to police training, huge issues, obviously today that have social impact. It had nothing to do with baseball hitting at the beginning. It had to do with my strange background, which was coming from a music background and not knowing anything really in neuroscience and needing something to latch onto as I was coming from physics. And so I started looking at musicians, how they make decisions. Then Jordan and I started talking one day, because we usually talked about baseball a little bit. And he said, could we do this with baseball players or athletes, other athletes? And I said, yeah, maybe, let's try it. And so we did. And so that's really where the germ of the company deCervo came from. And deCervo makes E-Train. It makes a host of other products in baseball, softball, umpiring in baseball, and hockey officials use software that we make too. So we'll touch a little bit more on those fundamentals really of what go into E-Train a little bit. But really what we're going to do in terms of the format today is we're going to start a discussion with Sergeant Hall, asking about some pressing questions today in police training, specifically centered around video camera usage, the fidelity or utility really of reenactments, and how that compares to real life footage from a body-worn camera or dash camera, and kind of the pros and cons to that. And hopefully we will get a look along the way at how E-Train takes some of that footage from either body-worn or dash cam footage and the associated decision-making required in those situations, and makes a training tool, a video-based training tool that can cover a broad range of applications in policing, from tactical decision making to recognition of escalation or de-escalation to decisions about use of force and many others. So Sergeant Hall will talk a lot more about that. But I want to encourage anybody who does have a specific question to put it in the chat. We'll make sure to get it. And I'll kick it off, though, Rudy, by asking about kind of the starting question really to all this, which is law enforcement agencies around the country have been gathering video data with either body-worn camera devices or dashboard camera devices. What are agencies, in terms of what you've seen so far, what are agencies doing with that data? How long are they retaining it for? And can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, so first off, thank you for allowing me to take part in this discussion today. Just for our audience, I'm not representing NYPD in my role here today. I'm coming as a subject matter expert. I've been dealing with body cameras in my agency for over the last 5 years, and also as part of my doctoral dissertation, I'm looking into research. I'm researching actually just the effect of body cameras on officers assigned to plainclothes, proactive specialty units. So I have a lot of experience between law enforcement and body cameras. What I've seen so far, so most retention periods will last from 30 days to 18 months. So like in New York State Police, NYPD have a retention period of 18 months, where there's some agencies out west I know only keeping their videos for 30 days unless there is evidentiary value, whether it's an arrest, regarding an arrest or some type of complaint, then it'll be stored for much longer. But if you go back, you mentioned before in-car cameras. So in policing, we've been capturing video before body cameras, going back almost 30 years of capturing video and hours of footage, and we still have not mastered and probably utilized it to its greatest potential.
Okay. Yeah. No, I didn't. I mean, personally, coming from the background I'm coming from, on the more the technical side, the science side, I mean, I think we've heard stories and we see in the news clearly about body-worn camera footage, and then in-car camera footage. Going back further, I mean, personally, I'm a little less familiar with that, but I think it makes the point that this data source has been there for a while, and I think I could maybe gander a reason why it's been cumbersome to deal with that data is when it was video, it was actual video, like magnetic strip video, and you had to rewind it and that kind of stuff, right? And so something that's foreign to anybody born probably within the last 20 years, right? Because they grew up with a camera being right on your phone, right? Yeah. And that's kind of something that I think might be part of the equation here too, which is that it's so easy to capture video on a device like this, right? And similarly, it's very easy for law enforcement officers to carry around a device like this. Many squad cars are equipped with their own iPads. And can you speak to that, Rudy, in terms of like department issued phones and in other agencies or more agencies you're familiar with?
Right, so I think it's becoming more common, especially some of the larger agencies where officers are issued department cell phones. Typically, most agencies, supervisors will have a department issued cell phone, but for like the NYPD, about 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago now, we actually issued department cell phones to every uniformed member of the service. So everyone has their own department cell phone. It's linked to our intranet, which allows officers to document encounters. They can access our patrol guide and other features through the department cell phone, which I think that's becoming more and more common across policing across the country.
Yeah, and not just, I mean, obviously not something that NYPD is leading, but it's something that is, you're seeing in other parts of the country as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's Yeah, and that's actually something that occurred to us when we started looking at how our background in neuroscience, decision making. I mean, we've been making baseball hitters, hit 95-mile-an-hour and up fastballs better for the last 5-6 years, from professional level to college level, and they're not 95 in youth, 95 miles an hour, but when they do have hitting problems if they're 10 years old, we've been working on those too. And we do it all through an app in the beginning stages. We have other more immersive types of environments. And I know that in police training, that is a topic that does come up, kind of virtual reality simulations. And so, one of the things that we looked at when we came to looking at the application of high impact decisions in police training environments is, how do we simulate what's relevant of the situation for the decision, but also do it in a way that is, I don't want to say convenient, but I'll say like operationally cohesive, right? The fact that all uniformed officers, 26,000 plus, right, at NYPD, have
36,000.
30, okay, 30, even more, have their own department issued cell phone, and it's a smartphone too. It's not like, it's like this. It's not a flip phone or something.
Right.
It's capable of viewing video, and it's capable of so showing video to the user, and it's capable of receiving input from that user in the same way that they make inputs like tapping on a screen for, I want this video on Instagram, I want that video, I want this text message, I want this input put into the intranet database when I'm putting in a report. So it's a familiar interface is kind of the way we thought about it at first. And there are ways to build up from there to make it more immersive. And, we could talk a little bit more about that, but our aim really is to provide some realism, the realism element coming from the body-worn camera footage. So can you describe, at least from your perspective, the differences between using like reenacted scenarios, which I know are very common in law enforcement, even training scenarios where people are physically, reenacting a scene, and kind of the differences involved there between like, what's the realism factor, what's the learning factor, and how does it resonate with trainees in your experience?
Right. So if we go look over the history of law enforcement, going back to the professional era of policing, which is in 1920, our training has been a static environment for the most part. We train with a firearm, shooting at static targets. We have lecture-based training in the academy for in-service and recruits. Static environment, right? In the past few years, we've started incorporating video when we talk about in-car camera video, and now body cameras, as well as sometimes CCTV video. We've started incorporating that in the training. But again, static environment, watching a screen. Scenario-based training has taken off in the past few years, and it is appreciated by most officers because it's a way to get some symbolism of reality, but it's still actors, right? So it allows for a controlled environment, but you're still using actors in a controlled environment, which policing is an uncontrolled environment, right? It's not a science, it's more of an art. And when we look at officers, especially today, and some of the situations we're dealing with, and the scrutiny and criticism and outside media attention that officers are under, training is probably more important now than ever before. And when we look at the options we have for training, outside of, even with scenario-based training, it's limited because you can only go so far, right? You can only get so physical. Typically, the aggression level of the actor, who's more than likely another officer, has a capacity which is limited because they're actors and they're cops. They're not really a person who's pissed off that they got stopped on the street. With body camera video, this is the first time. So you look at the first police department in the United States goes back to the 1830s in Boston. Mm-hmm. The NYPD's been around since 1845. This is the first time in policing where you're able to capture audio and video from actual incidents and bring it into a training environment, allowing the officers to watch a scenario play out and say, hey, I've been on that corner before. I've actually dealt with that guy before. I know that officer. And allow them to not allow, technology allowing us to use the video for training purposes. This is, I mean, it's a revolutionary step in where law enforcement can and should and probably will go.
Right. No, and yeah, thanks for, I mean, you know, kind of laying that out, because I think putting it in that context of history is important, that, you know, once going into this, you know, more professional area, because I think it was more of kind of a, you know, it's kind of a community policing type thing, you know, it's just like, hey, do you want to be in charge of being the sheriff of the town? Yes. And then like in 1920s, bigger cities, right? I mean, not as much like, you know, you move people from different parts of the city to other parts, and then this professionalization. But, you know, going from the static to the dynamic, right? Static was one step, then, you know, so that made it professional. Then the dynamic of being like, all right, how are you going to react in this situation or that situation? You're still just viewing it passively, right? And this is something it's not unique in police training. I mean, we see the same approach in professional sports too. And it's because it's something that helps certain people, certain players in that environment, certain officers in the policing environment. And then the capabilities developed first with, you know, magnetic film tape, you know, to do like real video reels and stuff like that, was only really amenable to viewing, passive viewing on an individual basis or a group basis where everybody's watching the VHS set at the front of the room. I mean, for instance, that's how, you know, we watched President Clinton's inauguration when I was 9 years old. You know, it was just like, it was a TV at the front of the hall and everybody had to watch that TV. But, you know, and over the years, you know, digital technology has made it easier to capture and store that video content. And that makes the whole infrastructure really there, that's provided by companies like Axon, for instance, or others who make the body-worn cameras, to store really that video content. Then the goal is really to then get into how we'll you know, then take the next step of utilizing the flexibility of digital content, right? Because a digital video is something that allows you to be put onto a phone like this, and then you can react to it. So I think, Rudy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought your description of static versus, you know, dynamic was interesting, because it sounds like you use static to mean you don't interact with it, or dynamic really means that you are interacting with it. Is that right?
Well, static is more, there is no interaction, and there is, there's not a tangible environment in the sense where you don't have a subject who's moving. So perfect example, shooting at targets, right? So an officer who has to qualify with his weapon, typically in most departments will shoot at a target, which is static. It's not a moving target. The overwhelming majority of shootings the police officer involved in are not situations where a target is not moving and just standing still, right? Mm-hmm. It's a high pressure situation. Your adrenaline's pumping. And it's often difficult to recapture that feeling in that real life scenario. Body cameras allows you to at least view it from an officer's perspective.
Right.
So when I say like the dynamic situation, those dynamic encounters.
Right. Absolutely. And getting that I mean, this is something that comes up regularly for us in our work with the NHL, with the National Hockey League. When we first started with the NHL, their director of officiating, Stephen Walcom, who was an official himself. He was a National Hockey League referee for about 15 plus years before he came onto the staff administration kind of side. And he specifically talked about the fact that, you know, we started making the product in that environment. It's called UCall. We started making that from the perspective of center ice cameras, which are in the audience at elevation, and they are, you know, they're particularly above the sight line of what you would see on ice, right? So you're not at the ground level of ice, and the gameplay angles that you're seeing are not the same, right? But one of the kind of points really that got everything started there is that the dynamics between the players was exactly what you would see whether you're on the ice or you're up at center ice or you're somewhere else in the stadium, right? And so we found that using video like that was incredibly useful for teaching new officials the dynamics of how to call different plays that are really body language reading instances. Where in this case of hockey, the body language instances are you leaning into a player and and then he trips, or did you actually body check him, or what are the ground rules really? And it's something that's hard to define. And it's actually something that I would like to highlight visually in a second, which is a point that the director of officiating at National Hockey League told us in a review of our performance with them, which was something I think applies to policing, is he said that we were teaching the new officials a rule book that is not easily defined by a common, standard. It's really an experience-based rule book. And that they were learning this experience really on an intuitive level, so that they don't have to go and look up in the book, all right, what is the definition of body check? What is the definition of an icing call, right? They can just see it and recognize it and make the call right there. Or they can see it, similarities to the actual, definition of it, and not make the decision, right? In other words, inhibit the response and pull back and decide, nope, that's not actually a tripping, the guy fell down on his own, right? And so when I think of, reading body language in pedestrian encounters and other situations, these are kind of things that, pop out for us. I will address a question that came up in the chat here just a little while ago before we got into that, great topic there. It is from Samantha Dorm, and she works on does a lot of grant writing assistance with agencies really across the country. And her question is, will this offer departments an opportunity to deliver training in a manner that adheres to CDC guidelines for social distancing? Therefore, could it be eligible for funding under COVID relief? Well, only a grant writer would find that angle. And I got to say, that's a great point, Samantha, this is something that I got to say yes is the short answer. Last week, we had an introductory call with the Deputy Superintendent Acting of the New York State Police. And he mentioned to us that, as New York City, very confined, right? New York State, very distributed, right? Across a lot of square miles, and particularly a lot of lines of sight that are broken by mountains and valleys and things like that. So they do training in a decentralized way, and usually officers are one to a squad car rather than two to a squad car, which is more common in cities like New York or Chicago. And we particularly talked about this kind of training being not only good for social distancing kind of environments that we're in right now, where you're only doing it on your phone, right? So you're either sitting at it, you could be sitting at a Zoom like this, like we are, and doing it on your computer. eTrain works on a laptop, or you could be doing it on an iPad, or you could be doing it on a phone like this. No interaction is required with another person. So if you think of the kind of reenacted scenes that we were talking about earlier with Sergeant Hall, here you've already got the real scene, right? So you've got all the realism of what an actual suspect does, what an actual encounter is like, what the actual body language is like. You won't have all the elements of adrenaline and kind of the, the danger element really in there, but you have a lot of elements of the audio. You have the audio and the video that can actually trigger those kind of, emotional aspects to the experience too. And will heighten the realism in a way that, not only is it social distance kind of, faux pas now to actually have physical contact, but is not as realistic, right? So that kind of those 2 points of being much more social distant kind of friendly, eTrain as a training tool now, and also heightening the realism, those 2 kind of big points are something that to highlight there. So thanks for bringing that up, Samantha. That was a great point. Again, a reminder to everybody, there is a way to ask the question in the chat. If you highlight your mouse, or if you hover your mouse over the Zoom screen, you'll see a button to hit that says chat, and that will pop up a chat window on the right side of the screen. So feel free to throw any more questions in there, and we'll work it into the topic flow. I did want to go back to a point we raised earlier about this rule book, this rule book that is a little hard to define with a set standard and that kind of stuff. That's just like you look it up in a book and you then apply it. So I want to actually share my screen for a second. Now, this is from a presentation that we kind of use as an introduction to E-Train. And since this is somewhat of an introduction to E-Train for some folks on this call, I think this might be a good time to switch to that. So I'm going to bring up on my screen 2 plots and a testimonial from one of deCervo's users, who I mentioned a little bit earlier. That's Stephen Walken from the National Hockey League. So everybody should see up on their screen right now a slide that talks about deCervo's decision training. And now deCervo is the parent company of E-Train, but we do decision training in a whole host of areas. And here's where we see some data that actually shows you impact from an application that's very much like what you see in E-Train. Now, as a caveat, I am being totally clear here that this is data from hockey officials learning off of videos, not police officers learning off of videos. But the mechanics, the underlying principles of how it works are exactly the same. And so we want to highlight that right here. But the goal really here is to, if there are any numbers that you remember from this talk today, is that the proven results we've seen from our decision training are right here. We see a 15% increase in decision accuracy, and particularly you see that that curve increasing with more unique videos seen and interacted with. So going back to Sergeant Hall's point about it's not just passively viewing the video, it is also interacting with it. In other words, I'm going to decide that this is the answer to what I do next, or I'm going to decide that this is an escalation event or a de-escalation event. So decision accuracy is increasing by 15%, and decision times decreasing by almost a quarter, by 25%. And so these are ways that the users are making better decisions and more efficient decisions as they're using deCervo decision training products like E-Train. And in the top right corner, you can actually see the exact quote testimonial, I'll say, from Stephen Walken at the National Hockey League, that we're teaching the officials, quote, a standard that you can't define really with a rule book. And obviously there are legal parameters that, on the federal level, the state level, and local level, when you go down to a city or a municipality or a town, that you have to adhere to, and clearly those have their own rule books. But as we know, there are a lot of gray areas, and there aren't cut and dry solutions for every situation that presents itself. So that's really something I want to highlight here about E-Train, is that at the end of the day, however it's done, with a phone, without a phone, in virtual reality, not in virtual reality, the point is this: we make the decisions better and we make them more efficient. So that's just something I wanted to highlight there. We can get into some more data. There's plenty of data available to talk about more, proven results in terms of the more you use it, the better you get, and then the faster you get in terms of making correct decisions. But I do want to open it up a little bit to go back to some questions really to Sergeant Hall to talk further about really like where body worn cameras are right now. And talk about it a little bit in terms of this distinction. Go unpack a little bit more what we were talking about between when a scene is reenacted versus when the video is coming directly from a real encounter. Can you talk a little bit about what because you teach curriculum, you teach the curriculum at NYPD to new officers. And advancing officers. Can you speak to kind of the reactions that you see from trainees as they're learning this stuff when they're looking at reenacted versus like real body-worn camera footage?
Right. So there is no comparison from taking a reenacted scenario. Oftentimes, cops do not like to do scenarios. I can speak for a couple agencies I've worked with. A lot of times, if it's doing a scenario in a room with 10 other cops standing around watching them, they're more hesitant to really get fully engaged in the actual scenario that's taking place. Whereas with body camera videos, these are real incidents. And you mentioned before the realism of the video, the emotion. So you can't really recapture the adrenaline rush, but what you do capture is that sense of, I've been in that situation before. So if you're dealing with a suspect who's using foul language and he's becoming aggressive towards the officer, sitting in that room, that officer can relate to what's happening. And outside of having a tactile type of training where we're putting hands on, which can get into, God forbid, someone getting hurt in scenario training, this is actually the next best thing that I've seen across the board with training.
Yeah.
A lot of departments use simunitions, right? Shooting paintball guns. Again, you have to worry about someone getting hurt, and they got to have the space for it. Right now with E-Train, it allows the officer to sit in his department vehicle, in the lunchroom, in his office, and he can train, right? He can use this treasure trove of videos that you're storing, and if it's not for an arrest evidence or involving some kind of internal investigation, most times those videos sit there and then eventually they're deleted. And we're paying for the storage. So it only makes sense that we actually use the video to help our officers to make better decisions.
Right, right. Yeah, no, and I'd like to just add some detail on that description of, how it captures the sense of, I've been in that situation before when you see it on body-worn camera, because it's on a neuroscience level, particularly high adrenaline, and potentially dangerous situations will drive fear. Everybody has it, and it's a way of, when you have that visual cue of, wow, I've been in that situation, or the audio cue of this suspect is using profane language, and you read the whole situation at once. It has this, ability on a neurological level, really, to transport you back to those types of encounters. And that's what we want in training. We don't want you to be in this sanitized, I know this is really my buddy here, or I know this is really my partner here, situation, because it. There's only so far that acting can go and a willing suspension of disbelief can go. And in terms of tricking your own body. And that's something we're really trying to do with E-Train too, is to, you get some benefits with reenactment, and we can talk a little bit about that in a second, but really the simplicity of taking the huge mountains of, video data that's available and stored. Departments are paying for this already, right? Millions of dollars really are being spent on collecting and storing video data right now. And the primary uses right now are after action reports. And then when they get FOIA'd, right, they're out in the open, and then that opens things out big time, right? And so what we'd like to do is find another use for this data. How can we use this data to, instead of, inciting big time discussion, right, that has somewhat of an impact, not really, we're still kind of working it out, I think, but can actually be taken in internally directly back to the officers that were involved, but more importantly, the many officers who have not yet experienced that situation and would like to learn that and would like to be ready for when they do get to that situation. So it's really proactive learning rather than after action learning. And that's really kind of the focus here. And from a neurological level, it's really about being able to stimulate that whole nervous system experience in terms of also the emotions involved of, wow, I've been in that situation before, and I need to know how I would react. And there are many times where, officers did not know how they were going to react when they got there, and, and then things happen. So if we can get them ready for that beforehand, it will save lives. If we can get them ready for that beforehand, it will save I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, I know in certain cities' cases when it comes to lawsuits, right? So we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars saved. We're talking about, hundreds of lives saved, at least in the last year or so, in terms of the really high profile cases. And, and this is something that we're really, excited to work with certain agencies about, both on the state level and on the municipal level. I do want to address, there was one other question that did come in before the one about the social distancing and the training uses of E-Train while we're in this era of social distancing right now, where it was a question about department-issued cell phones in terms of how prevalent that is across the country. New York City Police, is the most well-funded police department in the country. They have it for everybody, right? Generally, though, input from one of our listeners, it's kind of rare for the entire department to have it. More common that the supervisors would have department-issued phones. And there's no problem from our perspective in terms of delivering that training if that's the case. So I just want to make that clear to anyone who's looking at this from the perspective of an agency that, not all my officer uniform personnel have their own department-issued phones. That's fine. We can work with that for a variety of reasons. One reason is because E-Train can work on your personal cell phone, and it can remain secure using our security protocols that we have in place for E-Train. So that's kind of one point there. Most people in the country, at least in the country, have their own smartphone, and we can work with that. In the extremely rare situations where an officer, maybe the one person left in America who has a flip phone or doesn't have a flip phone at all, we can actually provide the software on a tablet that can be part of the department. It can just be hanging around like a video cassette player used to be, right? So that is something that we can do, and we can even make a custom, iPad for the department that has E-Train. Now, that's something I do want to highlight too, is the specific nature of E-Train to the departments that we work with. E-Train, as it was made for its first users in the Anchorage Police Department in Alaska, as it's been demoed for the Richmond Police Department in Virginia, as it was built for a specific case and investigative encounters for NYPD, those are ways that we have adapted E-Train to the specific needs of each of those agencies, right? The Anchorage Police Department has very different community policing needs than the New York City Police Department, right? We talked earlier about how New York State Police, who we haven't yet worked with, but are in the initial stages of that process, they have very different kind of community policing, right? It's much more decentralized, different safety issues in terms of only one officer to a car at a time. And so, whereas in a city, you'll have generally two. So those are some things that I would like to highlight. And I think now might be a good time, as we are starting to get towards the latter half of our time together, it might be a good time to switch over to just do a little show and tell on E-Train and show how it has been adapted to two different departments' needs, and then tell a little bit about how that is really the foundation piece for where it can go next, not only within those departments, and it will go next in those departments, but where it can go for your department or for others who you work with. So I'm going to bring up my screen here. Again, if anybody has any questions that they want to put to the chat, you can hit the chat button at the bottom. It'll pop up here, and we will get to those in time. So I do want to bring up right now our first example. Now, this is from what we made for Anchorage Police Department. Now, Anchorage Police Department has some very specific needs that are unique in some ways to Anchorage and are very common in many other ways to other agencies around the country. Pedestrian vehicle stops. You guys never get those in New York City, right, Rudy? Okay, yeah, those are definitely not unique to Anchorage. So So we'll, but one thing that is unique to Anchorage, I can tell you for sure, is this, what you see from the pedestrian stop on the left side of your screen right now, is that this is an encounter from a call that came in, and this encounter is happening around midnight in Alaska. So kind of strange for it to be midnight and there to be look like it's the sun setting there. But that is one unique aspect here, is that it is somewhat dusk at this encounter in this pedestrian stop. So what I'm going to do is jump into this pedestrian stop here in a second. I'm going to give you a quick orientation in E-Train as we made it for the Anchorage Police Department. Very important point to make. E-Train is the platform. What you need, you come to us, and our E-Train specialists work with you to make it your department's E-Train. So every officer has their own profile. That goes into the secure login that we described earlier, whether it's on a department-issued phone or on their personal phone. It is a secure login and their own profile where their statistics are kept track of, not from the perspective of this is something that's going to, necessarily be FOIA'd, but from the perspective of this is the data we're going to use to help you get better, right? It's up to the department to decide what they do with the data. Now, the pedestrian stop statistics I want to talk about a little bit here, because we're going to be going through the beginning of this scene, and really in the interest of time, I don't know if we'll get all through it, but every step of the way here are different events where you are tracking the escalation level. So you're watching a scene unfold in a pedestrian stop. You enter with a certain level of kind of escalation in mind. Why? Because you got a report of a burglary in the area. You got a report of 2 men on bikes as a description, and you are in the area coming with that information in mind. So the escalation is up a little bit, right? Now, when you arrive on the scene, you are looking for bits of evidence that tell you the escalation level has to go up further, or it's actually able to come down because these aren't the people you're looking for. And so every event along the way, you are given a decision to make, right? And the scene doesn't stop, just like an encounter in real life doesn't stop. You have to make that decision and go on to your next course of action from there. Now, in reviewing afterwards, you can see the general curve here in terms of how this scene unfolded, where the escalation level continued rising, something very familiar from pedestrian encounters. You can start with something pretty rudimentary, a counterfeit $20 bill, for instance, of recent memory, and things can really escalate very quickly, right, to the point where use of force happens, right? And so then once in this particular case, things became under control, and you see signs of de-escalation happening, and this is something that the user would have to recognize. Each step along the way, you're given a little tip afterwards in your review afterwards about what the reason was for why it was a de-escalate or it was an escalation. So we'll look at one of those encounters right now, and I'll give you a little narrative as we're going through it. I'm going to be double tapping on the screen when I think it's an escalation, and I will be single tapping when I think it's a de-escalation. Now keep in mind, this is taught to me by the Anchorage Police Department. This has nothing to do with my personal thoughts on this. I see the suspect look away. That's a potential sign of escalation. He's speaking with the officer here. This one is also speaking with the officer. The suspect grabs his handlebars, a potential sign that he wants to get away. So the conversation continues. Nothing really going on over here, but the conversation is going on over here. The suspect is continuing to hold on to his handlebars. We were told to look for signs where he's looking away or he's using his hands. At a point very soon, you're going to see an arrest is about to be made, and you're going to see some resistance to that arrest. So the officer moves in, and there's resistance to arrest. The suspect continues resisting, right? So I'm double tapping again. He's continuing to hold on to the bike, right? We're recognizing that again as an escalation. You have the other suspect here is calling out, right? Potentially another sign of escalation, right? And so these 2 officers are responding to the levels of escalation that they are being shown here. And so they're reacting in a way to try to, get the suspect off of the bike, get him down. Now, here's an interesting point. You see escalation, but then the other suspect backs off when he receives a vocal command from the officer. So that's telling us that things are starting to abate. We have one suspect who's brought down to the ground. They're applying the cuffs to him. You have this suspect who's backing off, right? You see he's still calling out potential signs of escalation, so you could call that a little escalation. But generally, this situation is under control on the left. Now, the specific tactics that they use to take the suspect off the bike, that can be a point that we discuss or that we incorporate into training. But right here, the focus of the department was how do we recognize signs of escalation and signs of de-escalation in an encounter? So generally, things are becoming under control here. You still have this guy over here calling out, but it's really not a concern at this point for the officers as they're subduing the first suspect over here. In the next, as we now go forward, you'll see they decide to arrest him. Now, he backs off, de-escalation. He's given a vocal command to get down on the ground. You see right there. He looks at his phone. He decides that he's going to get down. Okay? Another sign of de-escalation. He's told to put his hands behind his back. He complies. Another sign of de-escalation. And at this point, the third officer comes over and they help apply the cuffs or the bracelets. I don't know what they're using. To the point where we now get to a much lower level of escalation than when we entered the scene, right? And so this is really a specific case of being able to tap, double tap for escalation, single tap for de-escalation. Very simple, but it is an active engagement, dynamic, as Sergeant Hall calls it, right? You're dynamically interacting with this video. Now, you all are watching me do it, but I'm the one here who's watching this and making a decision about what I need to do. And at the end, it tells me, okay, great, you decreased the escalation level by 150% in the end. You came in with this high of escalation, you did what you needed to do, right? And then you brought things down to where things were under control and we could go on with our lives, right? And then afterwards, you can kind of see that track record here. You see it's a little different than it was before I started from a previous session. So any questions from the audience? I want to open it up to some questions at this point so people can ask, you know, what technology is specifically being used here, what neuroscience principles are particularly being used, anything in particular that anyone in the audience would like to, you know, comment on or raise a question about at this point. Okay, I want to open up to one question. I think we're kind of going towards the end of our time here. We'll kind of put a bookmark for a future Zoom seminar into another application of E-Train to more investigative encounters type situation where you've got not just tap or double tap, but where you have to actually analyze the situation and do like a multiple choice type selection, adhering to state law or constitutional procedures. I do want to, you know, ask some questions about we talked about it a little bit before about holding on to video or deleting it and certain policies that are in effect in, for instance, in the West Coast. I think Sergeant Hall, you mentioned it's 30 days. Elsewhere in the country, it can be up to 5 years. Is there any, do you see any potential, I mean, I guess changes in those rules or a need really to change those rules as different uses of body-worn camera or dashboard camera footage become available? Looks like you're on mute. My girlfriend wishes she could do that to me sometimes.
Typically, retention policy is based on department and state and local policies. So I don't know if we're going to see a significant change in retention policies, but the retention of body camera video for training purposes. So as a department, you don't have to delete that video. You have great video you want to use for training purposes. There may be a case where you need to redact faces, depending on that training and whether it's going to be used at any point outside of the agency. Right. But as far as storing it, that's really up to the agency. And once you remove the video from, if you're using, like, for example, evidence.com, which is Axon warehouse for their body camera video. If you remove the video from Axon.com, it's your video, right? So you want to store it in your own training database, that's an option for you also. You can use that video as long as you feel you need to.
Right.
And there's one other point to bring up, that drive home the importance of E-Train. When we talked about, I mentioned before, ecstatic training, like going to the range and firing your weapon at a paper target. Often it's pass to fail, right? You have to hit the target so many times. You pass, you fail, they take your gun and you gotta do it again. One of the unique features of E-Train is the ability to actually see if you're getting better. And a lot of times we have, like, even a scenario, you put an officer through a scenario, if the outcome is supposed to be an arrest, okay, he arrested the person, you can say, all right, he passed the scenario. But do we know, is that officer getting better? Is he recognizing, like in the video you showed from Anchorage, is he actually recognizing escalation and confrontation? Is he recognizing ways where he can de-escalate the situation without having to make an arrest in some cases? And he trained the ability to actually track officers to see if they're improving, which is the self-esteem thing. You know, it makes you feel good to see I'm getting better. And then you have a little competition amongst colleagues where you're answering questions faster, you're recognizing, you're answering more accurately and quickly. I think it's limitless where this technology can go and utilize the body cameras.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, it's not just for, baseball hitters and, and softball players to compete with one another. I think, there's a healthy element of competition really that can go into this wherever it's done, and particularly in policing. There are clearly some elements of competition that emerge even in the shooting range, right? And, why not take that kind of, healthy social dynamic and apply it to a whole other area of training that has to be reactive, has to be much more dynamic than the shooting range, right? I'm going to address a couple of questions that have popped up here, some very interesting ones. Again, thank you, Samantha, for bringing these up. Ms. Dorm is a grant writing specialist working with law enforcement for many years. And so she brings a really unique perspective here. And she writes quite a bit for Police One magazine. So the first question was, how much time must an agency dedicate to setting up these scenarios with the E-Train team? Generally, it's very quick. I can give you a real example from when we met Sergeant Hall and his colleagues who work on the curriculum for investigative encounters. Besides if we just skip to after you were allowed to release the videos to us, it was probably a matter of 2-3 weeks, I think, before you had a whole scenario with multiple branches and multiple what ifs in there. Is that right?
Right. I would also say that it depends on the agency, because if you're looking at that one encounter from Anchorage, so if you were looking at the lawfulness of the approach, do they have a lawful right to approach those two individuals? Do they have reasonable suspicion to conduct a Terry stop? 2, tactically, were the tactical approach, was it appropriate? And then 3, the de-escalation, escalation feature. So you can look at 3 different phases in that one encounter. So I would imagine, depending on how far you want to dig into that one video, would also determine how long that process would take.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think in general, the escalation, de-escalation, kind of that go, no-go decision that you have with Anchorage is many more videos in a shorter amount of time, right? Whereas the investigative encounters, where you have these different branches and what if scenarios, and when you start getting into tactical decision, options, that can take a little more time. But again, it's something that we're not the ones teaching policing. The agency is the one teaching us how to put it in so that you can teach it better to your trainees and more efficiently to your trainees. So none of this has to do with our opinions about what's the right way to do a Terry stop. None of this has to do with our opinions about the right way to restrain a suspect. It has to do with what your department policies are and how you want to teach them, and whether you want to teach them faster and more effectively, really, is the question. I think today everybody is looking for faster and more effective ways to teach their department policies. So to specifically answer the question about do they send video or handle directly in their department, generally what we do is we go from the starting point of having the video sent to us, to our E-Train specialist team. We analyze it to see where do a first glance about where the relevant decisions are. With some basic, guidelines from you all, we budget a certain amount of time in terms of hours to have a sit down with you and really learn point by point what are the decisions that are relevant, what are the things on screen that are relevant to identify, and then we encode that into the video, so to speak. In other words, we make it, we gamify it, is kind of what they call it in technology today, is that you gamify this video that otherwise you're just watching passively. Now you're interacting with it just like I was doing on screen a little while ago. So it can scale with the types of encounters you're interested in, but our team is really here to work directly with the agency to get the decisions that they want to have trained into this gamified video. And that's what E-Train becomes when it is adapted for your agency. We had another question. Does the training officer receive reports on the results to gauge if people are getting better? Yes, is the short answer. Not only does the training officer have that ability, but so does the training officer, him or herself. As you saw on screen, after I did the pedestrian stop and tracking the escalation level, you can see your statistics right there about how high you pushed escalation, how far you pushed it down as things started getting under control, and in terms of your recognition of the situation. And so, and that's really up to, again, a point where our E-Train specialists, we work with the department in terms of maybe you want just your training officers to have access to that. Maybe you also want the trainees themselves to see it, to try to stimulate some competition, healthy competition, to get them to learn these things better. I mean, in Brooklyn, where I live now, I'm down the street from a fire academy and fire department academy, and I see the new recruits there, and they got, we're going back to 6 hours of class, and they're sitting there and they're learning all this stuff, but it's a way of making that more engaging. It's a way of making that kind of learning more hands-on and more specific to the types of things that they're going to see when they actually do get out there. So it doesn't really replace at all the kind of learning that's done now institutionally, where the newer recruits learn from the older veterans. It only accelerates it, really. And it gets it out to large numbers of officers very quickly, and not just gets it out to them and they can read it when they want, because that's how a lot of training is done today. But it gets it into their brain and it gets it into their body, so that when they're in that situation, they can react on an instant and make that happen. So that I hope answers that question about how the data is involved here. And we can talk more about that on individual bases as people need, because I know there are some, issues of privacy and FOIA and other things like that involved, and we're happy to work through those. Our legal team is on hand to work through those kind of things as well. So I think with that, I'll start bringing it to a close. I do want to just highlight for anybody who does not know where our website is. I'm going to just bring put a link in the chat, so you'll see it on the right side of your screen. If you need to, see a little more visual-wise in terms of how E-Train works, we have some information on our website about that. You actually have seen, I think, quite a good amount already here today, and we are looking to expand what we have available online. But this is a great starting point for getting in touch with us. It's off of our main deCervo.com website, and the link is in the chat right now. So you can, or it's appearing at the bottom of the screen in the recorded video. You can use that link anytime to get in touch with our E-Train specialists. We'll be happy to talk to your agency, find out what your particular needs are, and how to take your camera data, your video data, and make it really the boost in training that you can, that you can use to save lives and to save really a lot of money. I mean, I was blown away by the hundreds of millions of dollars spent every year on defense of situations where it's police encounters and police misconduct type encounters. We're here to help on that. So I want to make sure everybody knows in the chat, there's a link to look at our page and reach out to us. We'll be happy to set up a quick Zoom call, even something like this. And so for Sergeant Hall and for my partner at deCervo, Jordan, I want to thank everybody for joining the first E-Train Academy Zoom seminar. Thank you everyone again, and there will be some subsequent email coming out with a link to this video. So if you want to share with your colleagues, that'll be a great way to do it. So thank you again, everybody. If there are no further questions, we'll call it here. Thank you again, and please reach out to us, deCervo.com/eTrain, or the link in the chat if you'd like to talk further with us. Thank you.
All right, take care.